I do want to ask, kind of in a time when a lot of folks are abandoning social media for one reason or another, it seems like you have stayed, and not just stayed, but have stayed fairly active. Let me ask, why stay on social media?
Well, that's a good question. I have moments when I think I'm done with this and I'm going to move
Mhm.
on, and those come fairly regularly, actually. And as many, I think, probably feel similarly during particular moments of national convulsion, whether it's
I'm
elections or
before
whatever.
recording, yeah, I mentioned it about
Um,
every 2 years, I think, man, I'm
yeah,
ready to bail.
yeah, and then when you have moments of national attention on something
Mhm.
that you get people on such polarizing ways, angry with each other and commenting and with anger. Yeah, those are moments when I want to leave, but I
Mhm.
stay. And I stay for several reasons, I imagine. One is I have a community.
Mhm.
There's a community that I have on Facebook. I've built relationships with people I've never met, even through that venue.
Mhm.
Secondly, I think that if we all leave, then what's left is might be potentially all negativity and total polarization.
Mhm.
So I stay in hopes to be somewhat of a mediator, to fulfill kind of a redemptive role. So what I post something every morning, for example, a quote from some dead Christian. I don't quote living people; I quote dead ones,
That's
because
well,
I don't want to get into arguments about the living people. So, but with the wisdom of the past and my function, if you watch those closely, I think you can see I'm actually commenting on the
I've
social
noticed.
situation,
Mhm.
but I'm doing it through past wisdom. And the wisdom is indirect. That is, it's not directly addressing whatever the question is,
Sure.
but the wisdom applies to a lot of the social conversations that are going on. And so I want to be a moment of good, a moment of reconciliation with my Facebook presence.
Mhm.
And so I think those basically the two reasons: community, and at least the role that I think I have,
Yeah.
or want to have, in terms of reminding people of the wisdom of a particular kind of path, a path of peace and kindness and welcoming and hospitality. And that path has the potential for transformation.
Hey everyone, welcome to Faith in the Folds, podcast for ministry, biblical studies, and Christian living. I'm your host, Kevin Burr. Today I sat down with John Mark Hicks, professor of theology at Lipscomb University in Nashville, Tennessee. I first encountered John Mark almost 20 years ago through his books, specifically his Come to the Table, Revisioning the Lord's Supper, published in 2002 by New Leaf Press. I was in high school at the time and had no idea I would later be required to read more of his works for graduate classes about 10 years afterwards. John Mark is a deep thinker, an excellent communicator, and a wonderful dialogue partner on social media. Which brings us to our topic for today. A few weeks ago, John Mark shared on his personal Facebook page 12 guidelines for positive social media interactions. What caught my attention was not just the wisdom of these guidelines, but also the fact that I've seen John Mark follow each of these with the various people who agree and disagree with him on a given topic. As I told Robbie John in episode 14 of Faith in the Folds, if there were one person after whom I would model my social media interactions, it would definitely be John Mark Hicks. If you enjoy the kinds of conversations we're having here on the podcast, would you be willing to like and subscribe to us? And maybe share us with somebody you think might benefit from this? And as always, thank you so much for tuning in today.
Well, John Mark, thank you so much, sir, for joining us on the podcast today. I am excited to dig into what we are going to dig into today here in just a minute. But before we get into all that, can I ask, I suspect there are going to be a lot of folks who are familiar with you or your work, especially folks from the Middle Tennessee area. But For those maybe listening out of the state or who don't know you very well, can you tell us just kind of a little bit about yourself? I know you're teaching, but how long have you been teaching? How long have you been working with churches? Help us kind of get to know you a little bit before we dig into what we're going to talk about today.
Well, thank you for having me, Kevin. I appreciate it very much. And this is a great opportunity. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in Churches of Christ. My dad was a minister. My wife, my mother was a teacher in public education. And so teaching kind of was in my blood from the very beginning. From the time I was 12 years old, I wanted to be a preacher of some way connected to the church, ministering in the church. And in those early years, I kind of gave up on a lot of other things and just threw myself wholly into reading my dad's library. So I read a lot of the books in my dad's library, most of them, in fact, especially those by Restoration authors, Stone Campbell authors of Churches of Christ. And I read so many debates, for example. So I was very much enthused with the prospect of pursuing that. Always wanted to do that. And I went to Freed-Hardeman, where my dad went, my mom went. So I followed in those footsteps and spent 3 years at Freed-Hardeman and got my bachelor's degree. Then decided to pursue graduate degrees because I wanted to go to Europe as a missionary.
Oh, wow.
Particularly in Germany. And so I also had a minor in German at Freed-Hardeman. But, my life was interrupted when my first wife died in 1980. And so I decided to grieve, although I don't know how conscious this was at the time. But
fair enough, yeah.
Grieving would be best done by going ahead and getting a PhD. Since I had opportunity, I didn't have family, I had insurance money. And so just circumstance led me to go ahead and pursue a PhD. And I decided to do that in historical theology because I'm always been interested in history.
Yeah.
And I've always thought history was a good way to become aware of our own prejudices and biases and to learn from those who came before. We're not the first ones to read the Bible. So I did my PhD at Westminster Seminary in Reformation and post-Reformation theology. And I chose that because it was like the precursor to Restorationism. So I prepared myself for actually becoming a serious student of the Restoration movement. And so I've done a lot of writing in that area as well. And it's informed everything I've written and taught, both Restoration history, Reformation history, church history, but also my exegetical work and biblical theology. I've been doing that for 40 years now. Been teaching in higher education for 40 years among Churches of Christ. Had my first experience of that back in 1982. So this year is the 40th year of teaching. Right now, I've been 20 years. Half of this has now been at Lipscomb University in Nashville, Tennessee, where I am professor of theology and teach in the graduate area. Master's degree students and doctor of ministry degree students, and loving every minute of it. Although I'm getting tired of the grading. Right, the grading is really, really a bothersome sort of thing. A lot of ethical dilemmas there. I'd really just kind of shelve that. Can we just go pass, fail, and let me teach? Assessing is not the greatest strength that I have in terms of, is this an A or a B or a C?
Right.
I don't like that part of it, but I do enjoy the students and I enjoy the intellectual engagement that happens there.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I'm fortunate enough to have an adjunct position with Harding School of Theology.
Oh, good.
But what I teach is elementary Greek, which is I would say a little bit easier than
that's a little bit easier to grade. A
little bit easier to grade.
More objective, right?
Exactly. Yeah, a little bit more objective. You got this. You spelled this word correctly or incorrectly, rather than, do you understand the subtle nuances here between transubstantiation?
You could get into a few arguments about translation, though. Right?
We get into some occasionally, but with sort of the baby vocabulary that we learn, especially in first semester, which at the time of recording is only a few weeks away. Um,
Well, as you know, I have a great love for Harding School of Theology. I
you
taught
taught there
there for
for
9 years.
9 years. I thought it was around 10.
9 years from
Yeah.
91 to 2000. So,
Yeah.
and I taught adjunct up until last year as well.
That's right. That's right. I never took one of your classes while I was at HST, but specifically your Providence and Suffering class was always spoken very highly of. Even despite the fun sounding name Providence and Suffering. Everyone I
Yeah.
knew who took that class always spoke very highly of it.
Well,
Yeah.
they suffered through, so they came out on the other end. Yeah.
Perhaps providentially. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lesson to be learned there.
Yes, sir. One thing that you mentioned in this biographical sketch that you gave us, that I wouldn't mind if we could dig in just for a second. I didn't prompt you ahead of time, but I don't think it'll be too hard to dig into this just for a moment. You mentioned that Reformation and sort of post-Reformation history is kind of a precursor to Restoration movement history. So for folks who are listening, Reformation, we're thinking of Martin Luther, John Calvin, guys like that. When we talk about Restoration, particularly the American Restoration movement, also known as the Stone Campbell movement, we're thinking of guys like Thomas and Alexander Campbell, Barton W. Stone, and then such figures like David Lipscomb, James A. Harding a little bit later, and so on. How is Reformation history? How does it serve as a precursor for Restoration history? Can you kind of just sort of briefly give us a little sketch on that?
Well, there are different impulses in the Reformation movement. I mean, for Luther, for example, the impulse was to restore the gospel, right? And even Campbell talked about the restoration of the ancient gospel. So there is a restorationist impulse even in Luther, except that for Luther, the restoration of the gospel did not entail a restoration of church forms or of ecclesial forms in the biblical text. He was more interested in reforming the church so that it was coherent or consistent with the gospel, right? Now, with John Calvin, you have a different scenario. He's very much a primitivist. He wants to restore the church as well. His reforming of the church was according to the model of the New Testament. So he wanted the church to look like the New Testament. So there is a
speaking the language of the churches of Christ here.
Yeah, very similar, because churches of Christ have that same impulse, and it's a reformed impulse. It comes out of the Reformed tradition. John Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli, the Puritans, even Presbyterianism in certain forms has that very strong restorationist impulse, where you do worship by the regulative principle. You're regulated by Scripture. So it's a very strong continuity, even in terms of the hermeneutic, which is the regulative principle and command, example, and inference. That hermeneutic was operative among the Westminster divines, for example, in the 1600s. Yeah. You can see it in Puritan writings. You can see it in Charles Hodge, the American Presbyterian. So it's not, we didn't invent something new here. We just applied it in a more specific way or a different way.
Yeah. So I guess to some degree then, since you went to Westminster Seminary in Pennsylvania, right?
Yes, Philadelphia.
Since you went to Westminster, they probably did things in ways that you thought, okay, I could see how y'all get to this, and given your own background. Is that fair?
That is fair. Yes, that's where I learned basically that there are some operative principles, shared operative principles between the Reformed tradition and what we came to know as Churches of Christ.
Yeah. That sounds like a fascinating conversation for another time.
Yeah, be happy to have that.
Thank you very much, sir. What I wanted to dig into today with you was a list of kind of 12 rules or guidelines that over the course of maybe a week or two, you had gradually posted on Facebook. Before we actually look at the list, though, I do want to ask, kind of in a time when a lot of folks are abandoning social media for one reason or another, It seems like you have stayed, and not just stayed, but have stayed fairly active for those who know you and follow you and are friends with you, say on Facebook or other venues. Let me ask, why stay on social media, given social media's often sort of generally negative reputation? Why stay?
Well, that's a good question. I have moments when I think I'm done with this and I'm going to move on. And those come fairly regularly, actually.
Yeah.
And as many, I think, probably feel similarly during particular moments of national convulsion, whether it's elections or
before
whatever.
recording, I mentioned it about every 2 years. I think, man, I'm
Yeah.
ready to bail.
Yeah, and then when you have moments of national attention on something that you get people on such polarizing ways, angry with each other and commenting and with anger. Yeah, those are moments when I want to leave, but I stay, and I stay for several reasons. I imagine one is I have a community. There's a community that I have on Facebook, and Facebook's the only social media I really pay any attention to. I mean, I have a Twitter account, but I post on that maybe once every 2 months or something. I mean, I don't even look at it, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
But Facebook, I'm looking at every day because I have a community there. I've built relationships with people I've never met even through that venue. Secondly, I think that if we all leave, then what's left might be potentially all negativity and total polarization. So I stay in hopes to be somewhat of a mediator, to fulfill kind of a redemptive role. So what I post something every morning, for example, a quote from some dead Christian. I don't quote living people, I quote dead ones. Because I don't want to get into arguments about the living people. So, but with the wisdom of the past, and my function, if you watch those closely, I think you can see I'm actually commenting on the social situation, but I'm doing it through past wisdom. And the wisdom is indirect. That is, it's not directly addressing whatever the question is.
Sure. But
the wisdom applies to a lot of the social conversations that are going on. And so I want to be a moment of good, a moment of reconciliation with my Facebook presence. And so I think those basically the two reasons: community and at least the role that I think I have or want to have, in terms of reminding people of the wisdom of a particular kind of path, a path of peace and kindness and welcoming and hospitality. And that path has the potential for transformation.
Yeah. All of that is extraordinarily admirable. And you may not be aware, but in an episode that I recorded maybe a month or so ago with a minister friend of mine down in Tampa, Florida, Robbie John, a name you may be familiar with. Robbie and I were talking about engagement on social media, and I think he was talking about resources that he has that kind of keep him fresh as a relatively young minister. I think Robbie's under 40. That counts as relatively young, right?
Yes, that counts as young in my book.
Oh, fair enough. Yeah. And he mentioned some works that you've published within the last couple of years, and we just sort of organically started talking about your presence on social media. And I mentioned, there, for a public audience, Robbie, there's a couple of things that John Mark and I would come down on, different sides of the issue. But if there were one person that I wanted to model my social media presence after, it would be John Mark Hicks. So as I was telling him that, it was a few weeks later when I noticed this list that you came up with, sort of 12 12 guidelines or 12 rules for engaging in social media. How did you come up with these?
Well, I appreciate that conversation you had a few weeks ago. Now I got to go listen to it. You know? But I'm grateful that I can be received in that way. Although it'd be better to have Jesus as a model, but he didn't have Facebook back then.
Yeah.
But how did I come up with this list? Well, I started a private group to critique some of my writings.
Okay.
A place where we could have discussions about what I'm writing and actually let them read things before I publish it. And this group has about over 200 people in it.
Wow.
They're not all active, of course, but
sure.
But I do put stuff up there that I'm going to publish and get their feedback and how they hear it. And so when I recently, when I began to put up some things on some very controversial topics, I created that list as a way of saying, look, this is how we're going to do this, you know, and you can't, these are not rules in the sense of, you know, you violate them, you're out.
Yeah.
But these are tips or guidelines for how I would like for this kind of discussion to go. And that we can have a fruitful discussion, a discussion that actually makes progress rather than getting into shouting match at one another. So I created the list for that group. And somebody responded after the list. They said, well, you ought to put this in other groups that we're members of, you know, and let them also hear this. I'm the administrator of this private group. So I felt like I could set out some guidelines.
Right.
But,
yeah.
you know, I'm not the administrator of other, I'm not the administrator of any other group other than that one. But yeah, so I thought, okay, well, let me just do this as a daily thing for 12 days, Facebook tips for discussion.
Yeah.
Discussion on Facebook. I guess you could expand that to social media, but particularly Facebook.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, Facebook is your primary social media outlet. You also mentioned that you're not administrator of any other groups. I'm surprised and somewhat disappointed to hear that you're not the president of the John Mark Hicks fan club.
Oh, I didn't know there was one.
If there isn't, there should be. Yeah.
Well, you know, maybe I ought to create. I'll create it if somebody will be administrator.
You could a name that comes to mind is Garrett Best. He's a good buddy of mine.
Yeah,
we'll give Garrett a shout out. To recorded an episode.
Garrett's
with
a great
him.
guy.
He is, yeah. Recorded an episode with him a couple of days ago, or a couple of weeks ago on.
I saw that.
Demystifying Revelation. That was a lot of fun. So let's dig into this list then. I'll read the first one for us, and these are sort of John Mark Hicks's 12. I don't know if you said not rules, maybe guidelines.
Or tips.
12 tips. Yeah. Okay.
Tips for a fruitful discussion.
Very good.
Have a fruitful discussion.
Yeah. First one, read the post carefully. If you think you want to respond, read it twice more. As far as possible, understand the main point of the post, its argument, and its tone. The first thing that stood out to me with this particular one is the focus or the mention of tone. What is it about tone that is important for us to notice and even care about?
Yeah. Well, it seems to me on Facebook, since you are lacking 90% of communication in terms of body language and so on, that stating your point in such a way that maximizes a healthy tone is really important, because the words by themselves can be so totally misunderstood, especially if you're being sarcastic or something of that nature, be taken the wrong way, maybe in a way that you did not intend. So paying careful attention to the tone of any response is maximum. I mean, we need to maximize that in terms of social media, because that's the only form of communication that is there, unless you put an emoji in there, right? Or something of that nature. That when you tell a joke, you need an emoji after you tell a joke in Facebook, it seems to me, because it could be misunderstood. So, and tone is important because it does shape the rest of the discussion. I mean, if you start out angry and harsh, that's going to be remembered. in the rest of the back and forth.
Yeah.
And it's going to shape how people hear you. There's a old saying that if I think one of the fathers, I think it was Chrysostom, maybe that said it. I may be wrong about that. That you can say something harshly and it may be true, but when you say it harshly, no one's going to listen. It's not going to sound true. So we have to be careful about that.
Yeah. I've noticed that just even with disciplining my own children. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. And if I can pull one to the side and sort of with this volume level, hey, buddy, we told you about that. That goes a lot better than, are you serious? Something along those lines.
Right. I've told you 1,000,000 times, right. And you yell it out like that.
Yeah.
And it's not as effective. In fact, it can be damaging.
Very much so. Very much so. It is. It seems like here it is absolutely necessary, and maybe this applies to all of them, or the majority of them. Is absolutely necessary for the person posting to try to be as clear as possible.
Yes.
And for the person reading to try as much as possible to really feel like they understand what's going on. That
right.
Really, it's a lot of effort on both sides. Is that fair?
It is, but apparently, but unfortunately, we don't see that effort most of the time. What we see is quick reaction.
Yeah.
Instead of responding, often I see kind of a reaction, and it could be a reaction of anger, it could be a reaction of a put down. How stupid is that? Especially things we're talking about, we disagree about.
Sure.
So reading it carefully and reading it again and again, making sure, did I read that? I mean, if you respond to something after reading it once, I imagine you're responding more to how you feel about what you read instead of what was actually said. And what you read may not be what was actually said because you read it quickly.
Right.
So you got to go back and read it again several times.
Especially, I can see this, especially if it's someone with whom perhaps one has had disagreements in the past.
Yeah.
So
yes,
already
exactly.
My senses are heightened. I'm on high alert anyway when I go in here. And if I read something that seems even to some degree kind of like the dumb things that I've heard them say in the past, dumb in air quotes here.
Right.
I'm going to be more.
Well, we have expectations,
very much so.
When a particular person we've had a past with, we have expectations, and sometimes our expectations will color. Well, they will color. What we read, unless we stop and pause and pay attention and read it carefully.
Yeah, very much so. Number 2, before you respond, take a few moments, even minutes, or if necessary, hours, to pray, calm your soul, and refocus your heart. Do not offer an immediate reply as if you have thought about this for a matter of seconds. Give it a few minutes or whatever time it takes to channel the emotion into something profitable, loving, and edifying. It is extraordinary to me to hear someone seriously suggest to take hours, maybe if necessary, before responding. Have you found this to be true in your own interactions on Facebook?
I have often, well, it would be hard to quantify, but I have on many occasions taken hours.
Wow.
I mean, I can get up in the morning and read a response to something, and I'm thinking, oh, that's outrageous. Why would they say that? And I could have immediately responded, but instead I take a shower, I relax, I do my prayer time, and I calm down. And I begin to think, okay, what is this person really saying? And what is it they're really after? How can I discern that? And be more reflective about my response rather than kind of immediately shooting off out of my anger, out of my disgust, or whatever feeling I'm having. Because I'm going to have those feelings. I'm going to have immediate reactions of anger and disgust. And how in the world could they think that? Or how in the world could they say that? I mean, I have that all the time, but that's not a place out of which to respond.
Mhm.
Seems to me we have to calm our souls a little bit, soothe ourselves a little bit, find the presence of the Spirit in our lives, and get to a point where we can actually respond with a helpful or a positive, not necessarily positive, but a response that is appropriately toned, and appropriate to the point that's being asked.
Yeah. I especially like the notion of just sort of returning back to it later. Give yourself some time.
Yeah.
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 That is something that I have done occasionally. More often, I've fallen in kind of two areas with this. When I find something that I think is outrageous on Facebook, I'll respond quickly, and it's always on my phone, right? When it's hard to
Yeah.
type and I'm trying to get there quickly, and kids
Exactly.
are around and I'm trying to do something else. I never do I run across any of these outrageous posts. You say outrageous tongue in cheek. When I have an hour for social media, I could just sit here and think about it. I'll either post in frustration, and then my tone is clear. I'm not thinking clearly enough, or I'll just say, I'm probably not going to change anybody's mind here, so I'm just gonna leave it.
Now,
When perhaps I could have weighed in helpfully. But
yeah. Well, I mean, there are times when I don't respond. I mean, I think we'll get to that later, maybe.
Yeah.
But there are appropriate moments to say that is not worth it.
Yeah.
It's not worth it.
Yeah. Very true. Number 3, when responding to a post, begin with affirmation. What do you appreciate about this post? Do you appreciate its curiosity, its point, its tone, its argument, or its search for understanding? Name what you appreciate about the post or the person. Talk to us about beginning with affirmation here. What does that do, generally speaking, to the conversation? How does that sort of get things going?
Well, I hope it says in the first place, I'm listening.
Mm-hmm.
I read you and I have something I appreciate about it. So I'm connected. I'm not just flying off the handle. I'm not just dissing on you. There are things about you I like and I appreciate, and I want to affirm that. Just like Paul tells the Corinthians, right? Everything's great at the beginning of the letter. You might say, well, Paul's being disingenuous. Well, no, I can feel that way about people, but then have some problems with them, right? Or with what they're doing or saying. So I think it sets up a different sort of expectation.
Mm-hmm.
That is, when I begin with affirmation, and it can be very simple affirmation, like "Thank you for responding." I mean, it could be just that simple.
Sure. Yeah.
But it sets up a different moment where the argument is not snap. It's not right off the bat. It is rather, okay, let's calm down. Thank you. But let's think about this.
Yeah.
So I think affirmation is a good way to begin.
I hadn't thought about it this way before until you mentioned it just a moment ago. That beginning with an affirmation, generates some kind of connection.
Yes.
Hopefully a positive connection. I hadn't put that together before, but that does make sense. You are basically extending or reminding someone. Perhaps reminding is a good way to put it. You are reminding someone that, hey, we do have this sort of positive prior connection that we can build off of that, even though we might disagree in what we're about to say.
Right. Yeah, there's something we share. We have something in common.
Yeah, I like that. Very much so. Number 4, restate what you understand the point of the post is. It's helpful to think in these terms. What I hear you saying is, etc. Often we don't hear as well as we think we do. What do you mean? We don't hear as well as we think we do.
Yeah, that can be complicated to do.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you're not wanting to extend a discussion in any great length.
Mm-hmm.
But it is often helpful to say, Now, what I heard was you're making this point or you're making this argument. Is that correct? Did I hear you well?
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then here's what I think. But give the opportunity. I think we have to exhibit some humility here that I may have misunderstood you.
Yeah.
And I may be taking this to a place that you would not have intended it to go. So I want to offer that recognition right up front that I could be wrong in the way I'm hearing you. So please, confirm or extend your comments. Tell me exactly what's going on in another way if I'm misunderstanding you.
Mm-hmm. I can see how maybe some might hear this particular one and think, oh, that feels so artificial, right? But unless I'm mistaken, I mean, the times that I have sat with a counselor, someone in the helping profession, they have done this very thing, sort of help, kind of restate what's going on in order to make sure that we're all on the same page here. Mm-hmm. As artificial as it may feel on Facebook, I think that's pretty valuable.
I think it's a great communication technique between a husband and wife, for example. What I hear you saying is, just to make sure I'm clear about where you're coming from. So that's another connection point, as you put it. Not only do we have shared common ground, but also we're actually communicating here because I'm confirming I understand what you intend to say. And when you confirm it, then, hey, we can make progress.
Yeah, very true. Very true. Number 5, when responding to the point of the post, state the response as succinctly as possible, but with sufficient clarity and explanation. Make the point direct rather than circumnavigating the globe. Direct, but kind and open to correction and dialogue. Refrain from long posts and cryptic ones. If it is too long, it won't be read carefully. If cryptic, your expectation that the reader will fully understand is a hindrance to dialogue and may come across as smug. I can't help but appreciate the irony that so far this is the longest rule or guideline. But why succinct, right? What kind of help us see that, why kind of pare down your prose here?
It may be just me, but my experience in my own internal world is the longer the post, the less I want to read it. I don't want to spend that much time. And if I want to read, I can read an article and I expect it to be long.
Fair. Yeah.
But when I'm reading a Facebook post, I'm, get to the point, as this is social media. This is not SBL or something where we're giving long papers and arguing about that. So I think succinct, if you write something long, I'm typically not going to read it. If I read it, I'm not going to read it well. I mean, I'm going to be struck by something that I want to respond to. So now I'm thinking about how I'm going to respond instead of paying careful attention to what you're saying. So I'm already formulating my response to the first paragraph. And that means the 10th paragraph doesn't get much attention.
Right.
Because I'm distracted.
And something in the 10th paragraph that might have mitigated your response to the first paragraph ends up getting missed.
Exactly. And I think it's also about focusing. The longer the response, the less focus there is. And I think in these kind of discussions, it's better to have a really clear focus of what you're saying. The other end of that is to be so cryptic that I'm not really sure what you're talking about, or be sarcastic and I'm not sure what the sarcasm's about. Cryptic, I think a cryptic response probably angers me more than any other, because I feel dismissed. I feel like, oh, you think this is so simple, you can just give me a sentence and it's over, or give me a sentence and you put me in my place. And so my ego gets involved in that. And so cryptic doesn't help in my mind. For one thing, you can be so cryptic that you're ambiguous. You can be so cryptic that nobody really knows what you're talking about.
Right.
And I've had to do that on many occasions, like, well, what do you mean? Do you mean this? That's when I go back with, do you mean?
Yeah.
Because you're not explaining what your point is. You're not telling me what the exact point you're making is. Tell me
Yeah.
the point instead of just being cryptic about it.
Right. It's it feels like in some ways almost like a bait where you're trying to
It can be.
oftentimes, yeah, or you're trying to lure the person who made the original post into suddenly fighting on your terms rather than arguing
Right.
on, here's the topic for discussion.
Right.
And now I'm not only am I defending what I have said with facts or logic or evidence or sound exegesis or whatever. Now I'm having to defend what you have only subtly hinted that I might possibly could be guilty of, or something along those lines.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. One of the more frustrating circumstances for me is when someone responds by asking a one sentence question, and then I respond. They ask another one sentence question, and I respond. At some point, I stop responding to that kind of thing. But it seems to me what I'm being, as you put it, baited. I'm being led into these leading questions or an attempt to box me in some way.
Right.
And then lower the hammer,
Yeah.
Why don't you make your argument? Please just make your argument.
Right.
And instead of just trying to lead me to a place you want me to go.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's, I'm reminded of some stories I heard in the Gospels where Jesus was baited to get trapped. I was like, oh, wait.
There's some truth to that.
Yikes.
Right?
Suddenly I'm playing.
And he answered with some questions of his own. Sometimes I do that as well.
Yeah. Very true. Yeah, very true. One other thing too about number 5 that you mentioned here, being direct. It is possible. It's preferable actually to be kind, direct and kind, but also in being direct, you can be open to correction, which again goes back to something that we've stated a couple of times already: the importance of humility in posting this.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I have that I've appreciated about you when I see you. And again, for the circles that I have run in, parting, growing up in Nashville, and so being familiar with you in those venues, and then also Harding School of Theology, and just because we have overlapping circles on Facebook and various groups in that venue. I have always appreciated how you present yourself as open to correction, and someone that has your reputation in the circles that we tend to run. That's very humbling and admirable, I think, in at least how I see it. So,
well, thank you. I wish I could internally live up to that one in every way. But I'm sure that's not always the case. But it certainly is what I think we're all called to as disciples of Jesus, to recognize, hey, we can be wrong, and we need to listen to each other.
Yeah. Certainly, I don't know anybody who's posted that John Mark Hicks is the most humble man in the world. That is obviously Moses, but
there's a comparison.
Yeah, that's right. Number 6, deflections and defensiveness do not lead to healthy dialogue. Consequently, in your response, do not reflect by changing the subject. What about? Oh, we're going to get to that one here in just a second. Or becoming defensive. Do you think I'm stupid? Instead, address the point at issue directly. Again, directness here. If you want to extend the point in a different direction, clearly identify that this is what you're doing. And then you give kind of an example of that. I know this is not your point, but I think it'd be helpful to think about this as well in order to illuminate our discussion. Talk to me about whataboutism. That's something that we often hear about. And it usually happens when bad thing X has happened. Somebody mentions bad thing Y and say, well, what about? Why is that not helpful?
Well, it minimizes bad thing X, right? Yeah. It basically says bad thing X is not so bad. Or somebody might even argue that Y is worse than X. So but it doesn't really get to address, okay, the badness of X.
Right.
You deflect it so that you don't really talk about the thing that's bad.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We can say both things are bad, both things are horrible, but we need a space where we can talk about X.
Mm-hmm.
And we need a space that we can talk about Y. Now, if you want to talk about Y, go post on your own page, and talk about Y,
Yeah.
But I posted about X.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to have a discussion about X, okay, let's have a discussion about X. But don't then deflect and take us off track by bringing up Y. Now, the exception to that might be that if bringing up Y illuminates something about how we experience X. But you got to tell me that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
That you're not just deflecting, you're actually trying to make a point that will help us understand X better. I think deflection is one of the major, if not the major, faux pas on Facebook discussions or social media discussions.
Yeah. Anytime I see any number of certain hot button socio-political issues, inevitably somebody will post, and we've just been using X and Y as examples here. The question is almost always phrased, well, what about this? What about that? As if to say, well, like you mentioned, that X has no validity, or Y has greater validity, or like I said, is more is more horrible. I like how you mentioned that here. If it's my post, right? Like if it's my post and we're talking about X, I think it's at least fair to let me kind of, be able to state, hey, we're going to talk about X here in this particular venue. If you want to talk about Y, fair enough. You are free to do that. But then there are times, like you mentioned, where we could actually have Y come up to illuminate what's going on. But as you've mentioned earlier, the importance of clarity and explanation. It might be the most charitable thing to do to your dialogue partner to say, hey, I would actually like to mention Y, because I think it can help us kind of see some way where we're maybe missing some overlapping connection or something along those lines.
Right.
Yeah.
So you use Y to help you understand X.
Very true. Yeah.
So if in that case, but tell me that's what you're doing, and don't do it in a way that takes the focus off of X, because that's the bad we're talking about, or the good that we're talking about. Either way.
Very true. Yeah. Number 7, don't speak in absolutes. Rather, speak out of the situated character of your thinking. For example, quote, in my experience, or quote, as it seems to me, quote, or this is how I see it fitting into, et cetera, et cetera. State your conviction, argue for it, and provide substantial reasons, while at the same time demonstrating, once again, humility and openness to listening to the other. What is the value of sort of kind of dialing back the absoluteness of your statements? Is there a time to be absolute in them? Maybe let's talk about what is the value of kind of dialing that back a little bit first.
Well, I think it's about epistemological humility. It's about the humility of what we know and don't know, and how well we know it, and what level we know it at, and whether we're interpreting it well, whether we're stating it well. All those are human fallibility and human finitude ought to caution us that no statement of ours is absolute, in the sense that it is an uninterpreted thing out there in the vacuum. Every statement is subject to interpretation. Like even saying God is love. Well, it depends on what you mean by God, and it depends on what you mean by love, and even depends on what you mean by is, because is might mean several different things.
Famous
right?
question back in the 1990s.
Yeah, exactly. So God is love is a true statement, I think, but it's an interpreted statement.
Mm-hmm.
It gets interpreted in our heads.
Yeah.
Because we could all agree God is love, but a universalist could say it and a particularist could say it. They mean very different things by
Fair
that.
enough. Yeah.
So we don't speak in absolutes in that sense. Now, I think there is absolute truth.
Mhm.
I think there are truths that are absolute. God is, right, is for me, and God is the absolute truth. But my finitude and my fallibility ought to, it seemed to me, generate a kind of humility that says, I may not have understood that well, and I may not be able to say that well. So I need help and community to say that better. But right now, from where I sit, this is what it looks like to me.
Yeah.
And I think there's just humility in that, and an openness to correction. If I state something in such a way that is so absolute that it cuts off any possibility of learning something different, or cutting off any kind of possibility that I might be wrong, well, there's no dialogue there.
Yeah. At least none that's profitable.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, there could be an argument.
Yeah.
But not a dialogue.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. I like that distinction. Yeah. So far, I mean, we're halfway through this list. So far, if there's been one common thread that either has been stated explicitly or at least resides implicitly in each of these, it's been the importance of humility. I think that was probably one of the things that struck me the most when I was reading this. So let's continue on. Number 8, in longer posts, and I love this parenthetical aside that you have here, which are not typically recommended. See number 5, if you could say.
Right, exactly.
In longer posts, which are not typically recommended, it is sometimes helpful to enumerate the points you are making so that readers don't miss them, confuse them, or conflate them. For example, I might respond to a post by listing 3 separate points. They may all 3 respond to the same argument, or they may be 3 different questions or issues related to the post. Enumerating them helps subsequent responders to precisely identify the referent of their response. So do you actually go through and, in a longer post, you'll actually say, okay, here's one thing I've noticed and another thing I noticed, and if necessary, here's a third thing I wanted to bring up.
Yeah.
Do you do this with longer posts?
Well, on my public Facebook page, usually not, because I usually don't write long posts.
Right.
I keep them short and brief for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
But in that private discussion group
Mm-hmm.
where we're talking about my new book or manuscript or something like that, then I'm enumerating. I'm saying, okay, point 1, 2, because when somebody responds to something that I've written, I want to know what specifically they're talking about and what specific thing is provoking or evoking this kind of response.
Yeah.
And so I'd love it to be enumerated, so I can say, oh, we can have a clear discussion or clearer discussion if they enumerate, oh, here's number 1, I have this problem, and then I can respond. Oh, responding to number 1.
Mm-hmm.
It can also be about an economy of words as well. That we don't just keep restating it over and over again, but we say, oh, number 1, it's like telling a joke, right? Number 1, everybody laughs because everybody knows what number 1 refers to.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a value in that. So yes, in longer posts, I like to use some kind of structure. Mm-hmm. Now, enumeration is just my suggestion.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
But some kind of structure where I know what you're responding to and you know what I'm responding to. Because how many times you've seen on Facebook somebody respond in a way that they just go off the handle and the person responds to them by saying, where did you get that? What did I say that made you think that? Well, if we're clear about this is what you said, restating what we heard, right? This is what you said, and here's my response. And if there's like 3 of those, then just identify them, in some way. So that we can keep them separate in the discussion and not conflate them.
Another name that you may at least be familiar with to some degree, because I think he's active in some of the Facebook forums that you and I are in, is my friend and youth and family minister at Cloverdale Church of Christ in Searcy, Arkansas, Luke Dockery.
Luke.
He does a great job with this, even in text, like personal text messages. And he and I have been friends for for over 15 years now. Even in personal text messages, he'll do bullet points and stuff like that. It's great, and I love the way that he handles himself on Facebook in a manner that is very similar to kind of what we've been discussing today. Talking about the economy of words, you mentioned that. That's a phrase that maybe a lot of folks might not be familiar with. What do you mean by that, and what's the value of that?
Well, economy of words is about brevity and precision and focus. So let me say what I want to say well, but in as fewer words as possible. Because the more words you use, the less likely people are reading carefully.
Yeah.
In a social media context.
Yeah, that's fair. I like that. Social media, it's fascinating because it's often billed as sort of a lighthearted way to stay connected with folks. A lot of people use it for sharing, funny memes or sharing family pictures and stuff like that.
Yeah, nothing wrong with that. Yeah,
and that's great. I enjoy seeing that kind of stuff on social media. What's interesting though is that I wonder if that has colored a lot of people's perceptions of it. So they come to it with maybe some expectations of sort of lightheartedness, or maybe not expecting anything substantial. And then when they come across a provocative, positively or negatively, provocative post or something along those lines, suddenly taken aback, and they're not used to
I hear that. I think that's a good point. That it can create expectations of what you're about to read by what your perception is. What is the function of this media? Instead of seeing kind of its broad function, that it can have a lot of different functions. If we only have one framework in mind when we read something. And when I say economy of words, memes, sometimes I'm not a fan of memes myself, even though I like the funny ones. I like the funny ones.
Star Wars ones are great, right?
Yeah, I like those, but memes can also give you a contextless proposition.
Yeah.
That is so off the wall. It has no context to it, has no nuance to it. It's there for shock. It's there for, poking the bear, you might say. And there might be a place for that, shocking. Jesus had some shocking words at times. So I'm not opposed to that, but there was also very much a context for those words. I had a narrative context in the Gospels for those words. So, I mean, I'm very careful with memes. I don't think I ever post a meme. I don't know that I'd have to go back and look. I can't say never, but I don't usually find them that helpful.
Yeah, that's fair. Maybe some kind of Chicago Cubs meme or something.
Now that might be true. You might have got me there.
That's fair.
That might be. I might have some Chicago Cub meme up somewhere.
I feel like you and Scott McKnight would be pals.
Yeah, we're big Cub fans. Yeah,
so that kind of thing.
In fact, we talk about that when I have occasion to talk to Scott. We have mentioned that's something we have in common.
Very good. Very good. Number 9, clearly state where you agree with the post. Then state clearly the point of disagreement or disagreements. We will disagree. It should be understood that a statement of disagreement is not a personal insult. It should have no intention of offending the other. At the same time, the disagreement must be stated in a way that does not insult or intentionally offend the other. For example, attack their character or intelligence. Basically, you're warning people about the ad hominem attack.
Right.
What are ad hominem attacks, and why are they so damaging in these kinds of settings?
Yeah, it could be about their family of origins. It could be about their educational. It could be about their character. I expect that from you. You went to school at Westminster. Something like that. Or you went to a liberal institution.
Yeah.
Or you teach at a liberal school, or any number of things that identify you and identify the character of your argument.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the focus is not on the argument, the focus is on your person and how your personhood or your identity or your history automatically invalidates your argument.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That'd be the ad hominem. Yeah. And that happens all the time on Facebook, it seems to me. We've already got people pegged and we don't really listen. We just dismiss them because we know who they are and what they're saying. Yep. And we don't have to pay attention that closely.
Yeah. In some ways, that strikes me as painfully lazy. I don't have to do any legwork, right? Yeah. I don't have to actually engage your argument if coming from the institutions that I've come from, I know where you teach and I know where you go to church or fill in the blank, right? I no longer have to actually try. I no longer have to worry about being challenged. I no longer have to worry about expressing humility or being to any degree open to correction.
I mean, I get that in so many different ways. I'm not going to read your book because I know what you're going to say. And that happens at a smaller level at a on Facebook. But then, I mean, these are pretty detailed guidelines, but remember that they arose in the context of having detailed, thorough discussions about writings. These are not created to manage 3-sentence Facebook post,
Sure.
So this was a community in which we were going to engage in discussion and argument and, back and forth. And so the detail kind of reflects that.
Yeah. Very good. I particularly appreciate this one because I have received these kinds of insults in the past and unfortunately have given them, or at least thought them. Let's be fair, at least thought them in the past. And so this one, when I read this, I was like, yeah, get them. Oh man, it gets me too.
Yeah, well, you take all 12 of these and I've violated each one of them in some way at some point, so.
Yeah, that's fair.
This is not a perfectionist description. Okay?
Yeah. Number 10, kindness and gentleness are always good and healthy virtues. There's no place for name calling, like we were just mentioning, or attaching a label to one who does not accept it or see themselves in that way. There's no virtue in beating up or shaming the other. Gentle correction is appropriate. Posting ought to assume one is willing to receive gentle correction, but unkind put-downs, labeling, or dismissals are unacceptable and counterproductive. Talk to me about labeling here. The second sentence in this one is fascinating. No place for name calling. That seems fairly straightforward, right? There's no place for name calling, right? Or attaching a label to one who does not accept it or see themselves in that way. Can you dig into that for a little bit and kind of flesh that out for us a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, it can be tricky, to be sure. It's not something that is going to be easily discerned, it seems to me, because there are appropriate times for labels, just as a way for typologies of understanding. But I think we have to be careful with them, especially when someone says, well, that label doesn't apply to me. And it might not apply because of the way they think about the label. And I may be thinking very differently about the label.
True.
So when I'm going to use a label, and again, I'm not perfect about this. I don't always do this even as I think it ought to be done, right? But when I'm using a label, I don't necessarily attach it to the person. I describe what I mean by the label and state the particular idea associated with the label. And I let them decide whether it applies or not. And let them distinguish, well, okay, yeah, if you say it that way, okay, but that's not what I usually hear or what I usually think about when I think about that label.
Yeah.
So I can use a label like a Calvinist or an Arminian, or I can use a label like patriarchy or whatever. I want to give the other person the opportunity to say, no, I'm not that, and here's why.
Yeah.
At the same time that I'm saying, here's what I think that is. Would this fit the description? Would this fit you? And give them the opportunity. In other words, instead of just slamming it down on them,
Right.
And say, you're that whether you think it or not, you know, it's better to hear what they have to say about it, seems to me. And certainly not shame them about it. It's not, shaming is not going to help anything in discussions like this.
Very true. Yeah. The thing that I've noticed in times when I've been in more heated discussions on Facebook and labels start coming out, or in an attempt to kind of explain myself, I might try to carefully nuance a particular label. I've noticed that unless I go at great length to very carefully explain how I'm using a particularly charged term, I open myself up to attack. And I think I mentioned, I don't remember if I mentioned during the recording or prior to that, you know, in one particular exchange I had on Facebook last year and a half, 2 years ago, something like that. Some very rude things were said about me. Thankfully, not by friends. You know, I had friends, you know, argue, people that I care about and, you know, and love and respect and know very well, were people who were not, you know, jumping on this particular issue. They were coming to my defense. But I used a term that I simply did not know would be so charged. And I am beginning to see that maybe labels in general would be wise to try to stay away from. Maybe you wouldn't go that far, but I can see how at least labels in general would be wise to maybe steer away from. Maybe there's a time and place, and that time and place isn't maybe as frequent as we think it is. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think in general, instead of identifying a label, we just want to describe the concept. And somebody else will say, oh, well, that's, and label it. Label
X, yeah.
And then my response might be, well, I don't know exactly what you mean by that label, but if it means ... then okay, that's what you think of me, but I don't necessarily label myself that way, or you know, something of that nature. Yeah, I think, you know, in teaching, I use labels. I mean, when I'm teaching a class in historical theology, I use labels like Calvinist and Lutheran and Catholic and Arminian, and because they're historical typologies that help us organize ourselves, organize the history in certain ways. So labels are not in themselves bad.
Right.
It's how we use them and what we assume about them.
Yeah.
Or that we use a label and therefore categorize everybody under that label as the same thing, you know. Well, no, Reformed theologians have a diversity among them. You know, Lutheran theologians have a diversity. So I can use Lutheran, and it might communicate something in common, but it doesn't give us the opportunity to nuance differences by just labeling people.
Yeah, that's probably helpful for me, because it's tempting, whether religious, you know, in terms of like a, you know, historical theological label, or socio-political, or whatever it is. It might just be helpful for me, and maybe folks who are like me, to begin thinking of labels less as boxes, right? You fit into this box with these rigid parameters, and maybe more like something along the lines of, this is a weird metaphor, but the only thing that comes to mind, first thing that comes to mind, is like a cloud, right? You kind of fall under this general area, but there's different shades of meaning that we can kind of see here and there.
So, I think that's helpful.
I can nuance that a little bit.
We can think of labels as generalities rather than specificities.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. Number 11, in closing, express your love, commitment to dialogue, or your desire for peace between you and the other. One can simply say, peace, sister, or more expansively, thank you for your commitment to dialogue and understanding that means so much.
Of
Why?
course, be sincere when you say it.
You're dumber
Don't
than a
lie,
bag of rocks.
you know.
Shalom, brother.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why wrap up this way? How does that, what's a value in that?
Well, let's leave our dialogue at a place where we can continue it.
Mm-hmm.
That we're not shutting it down. We're not shutting down this relationship. We're not saying, "Oh, I'm done with you. This is over." Let's express the common bond that we have. Peace, sister.
Mm-hmm.
We have a common bond, so we can talk about this again sometime. We're not. I have not unfriended you, kind of thing. That. Although I have unfriended some people.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And we get to that number 12, perhaps. But yeah, so a sincere expression of a desire to continue the relationship and even to continue the dialogue on another occasion.
Mm-hmm.
I think Paul begins with affirmation and Paul ends with benediction, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is how Paul cares for the church.
Yeah.
And I think it's how we can care for each other as well.
Yeah, very true. Very true. I like this, commitment to dialogue. You, in a sense, you are pledging, your commitment to continued friendship, continued unity in Christ. Since the original context of this was in a group of Christians helping you working out these things. Yeah, very true. All right, number 12. When do I stop replying or posting on a thread? Typically, 2 or 3 responses is sufficient to address a specific question with an appropriate give and take. Facebook is not a good place for extensive discussion and long posts. Okay, you've hit that one a couple of times before.
Yeah.
Again, that's your personal preference. But here are a few pointers that have helped me. A, when I feel frustrated and I cannot respond well with kindness, I don't respond. B, when I feel like we are at an impasse or at the level of a fundamental disagreement and we have both made our point. C, when the time it is worth taking is not worth the effort in the light of other things I need to be doing, including resting. And D, when I summarize my point, clarify, and, quote, let it go, while acknowledging this will be my last word in this thread, but inviting the other to offer a final reply. I think you summed it up pretty well right there.
Yeah, it's the last one is important. I think we have to be willing to let the other person have the last word. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, there's no end. We'll just keep going back and forth, and usually going back and forth 20 times in the space of 30 minutes, which doesn't fit with the rest of this, right, that we've talked about. And that has a tendency then just to escalate rather than moderate or have some helpful point. So yeah, there comes a moment when I say, I'm done with this. I made my point. You can listen or not, but I'll give you the last post. You can. Yeah. And boy, I have people who use that last post for 4 or 5 or 6 paragraphs. And there's everything in me that wants to respond. I really want to, really, you did that. You took that last opportunity to just boom, and I really want to respond, but I keep my commitment. I said, no, I'm not going to respond. And people who read that they can see what's going on. I don't have to explain it to people for the most part. So I think that last point is really important, that we have to be able to say, I'm not going to have the last word on this thread. And that's the only way, in many ways, that's the way it's going to end. I have very few people who, after I have my last word, they keep responding 4, 5, 6. Those are the people I will block.
Yeah.
Who don't give up. Now, I never blocked anybody until about 2 years ago.
Really?
Yeah. And I finally decided that they were abusing my page, that they may get 10 views on their page, but they'll get a lot more on mine. And so they're using my page to make to promote themselves and promote their views. And I just decided, look, if you can't abide by my rules, then I'm just going to block you and not allow you to post on my page. So I decided that that's what I had to do with some people, because they just kept going.
That's a fascinating realization that they were basically using it. It seemed to you, right, to go back to
it seemed to me.
Which exactly. One we were talking about earlier.
I don't know that's what they were doing, but that's
right,
what it seemed to me.
We're avoiding absolutes, right? That's number 7.
Right.
It seemed to you they were using your page and kind of the audience that you've garnered over the years as a way of kind of propping themselves up. Oh man. Oh, that's kind of cringy.
Espousing their views. They want their views to be known. They want a particular point made. And when they make it on their page, nobody reads it. So they find a way to use other pages to make their points. And these are the trolls and the argumentative types and the people who need a place where they can be heard. And I'm just not going to allow them to do that on my page when what they want to say is abusive and doesn't abide by rules that I lay down. And of course, they have to be repeat offenders. This is not just kind of one time or 2 or 3. This is repeat offenders who keep doing that.
Understood. Yeah. That bringing me to my next question. Has there, and obviously I'm asking you to speak in generality, so I'm unwilling to throw anybody under the bus in this venue. Has there been an instance where, first comment out of the gate, you said, "Whoa, I'm not touching this. I'm not handling this," or do you try as hard as you can to respond charitably to anybody and everybody who comes into the door?
Yeah, no, I have no commitment to respond to everybody, to be
Fair
sure. And most of the time I don't respond. Most of the time it's when I feel frustrated. I'm not necessarily frustrated, but I don't feel a need to respond. I let people make their own decisions. People, they can see whether it's an appropriate thing or whether it's a good argument, or I'll let them decide. So most of the time I don't respond. If I think it's abusive or it is insulting or it uses language that I don't allow on my page, then I'll delete it. I delete comments all the time without warning. And if they come back at me and say, "Why'd you delete that?" I say, "Well, I deleted it because 1, 2, and 3.
Enumerating your points.
Yeah. So if you don't want to be deleted, don't do 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah. That should be the next list you make. Here are the things that will get you deleted.
Oh, there you go. I just inverse all these, right?
Yeah, basically, 12 tips for getting booted off John Mark Hicks' page.
If I gave the list of what would delete you, I'd have to delete it because it would have all that stuff in it.
That's right. That's fair. Well, John Mark, I really appreciate the time that you've given to that initial group that was that sort of generated this list here, this list of tips for a healthy and fruitful discussion. Appreciate the time that you've given us this afternoon. Is there any kind of closing statement, anything you want to leave us with as we wrap up this afternoon?
Yeah, well, when we're in personal presence, I hope that we always have something conscious about us, that we are representing Christ in our personal presence with other people. And that when people are looking at us, they're looking at who we are. And I think in our Facebook post, we need to be reflective of our God. We need to be imaging God in these moments, imaging Christ in these moments. And if we post something that reflects negatively on Jesus or negatively on our faith commitment and who we say we are, we do so much damage. We do so much damage. We damage not only ourselves, we damage the community in which we're talking, we damage Christ, and no telling how many people, because of their experience of Christians on Facebook, will not listen to Christ because his people have not modeled Christ before them.
Yeah.
We have a great responsibility when we're putting something out there that the whole world can see. We'd be better. That ought to be a moment of deep reflection before we put it out there. And why are we doing this? What are we doing it for? And what impact will it have? And what good could it accomplish? What evil could it accomplish? So we are representatives of Jesus. Let's act like it on Facebook.
Amen. John Mark, thank you for your time, sir. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate it very much. Thank you for having me.